It was still dark outside when the city airport began to fill with travelers rushing to catch their morning flights. People lined up at check-in counters, dragging suitcases, yawning and sipping hot coffee. The sound of rolling luggage and boarding calls echoed through the terminal. Among the crowd was a calm-looking black woman in her 40s. She was dressed neatly in jeans and a simple jacket, carrying a leather handbag and a folder under her arm. Her presence was quiet but confident, the kind that didn't need attention to be noticed. She had an early flight to another state, where she was scheduled to speak at a leadership event later that afternoon. It wasn't her first time flying, and she preferred to travel alone. She liked to keep things simple. No assistants, no loud phone calls, no fuss. Just a woman doing her job and moving on to the next thing. As she waited at the gate, she smiled politely at the boarding agent and took a seat by the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with faint orange light. She took a sip of her coffee and pulled out her phone to check her notes for the upcoming event. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot were preparing for takeoff. The pilot was an older man, experienced and proud of his career. He'd been flying for over 20 years and liked to talk about how he'd seen it all, but those who worked with him knew he could sometimes be rude, especially when he thought no one important was listening. When the passengers started boarding, he looked out from the cockpit window and watched the line move slowly. His co-pilot kept checking instruments, focused on the pre-flight routine. Then the pilot's eyes landed on the woman stepping onto the plane. She smiled at the flight attendant and walked toward her seat near the front. The pilot frowned slightly, mumbling something under his breath that the co-pilot couldn't quite catch. As the woman placed her bag in the overhead bin and sat down, the pilot whispered quietly, "Some people always think they belong in first class." The co-pilot gave him a quick look, unsure if he had heard correctly. He didn't say anything, but there was a brief silence that hung in the air before they went back to their work. The flight attendants greeted everyone cheerfully, going through the safety instructions. The woman listened carefully as she always did, then fastened her seatbelt. She noticed the pilot's tone when he spoke over the intercom. It had a sharpness to it, like someone who was used to talking down to others. Still, she ignored it and focused on her thoughts. She was thinking about the speech she'd give later that day, about leadership, respect, and fairness in the workplace. She didn't know that in just a few hours she'd be tested on those same values. The plane began to move down the runway, and soon they were climbing through the clouds. The city lights faded beneath them. The woman gazed out the window, enjoying the peaceful view. For a moment, everything felt calm. An hour into the flight, the air started to get bumpy. The seatbelt sign came on and the plane shook slightly. Some passengers tightened their grips on the armrests. A few nervous laughs filled the cabin. The pilot's voice came through the intercom, trying to make light of it. "Just a little turbulence, folks. Nothing the sky can throw at us that we haven't handled before," he said. Most people smiled or relaxed, but the woman sitting near the front noticed the pilot's tone again. There was something smug about it, like he was showing off rather than reassuring. After a few minutes, the bumps grew stronger. A passenger in the second row started to feel dizzy. The woman noticed him breathing heavily and pressing his hand to his chest. She leaned over gently and asked if he was okay. He nodded weakly but looked pale. She pressed the call button to ask a flight attendant for help. The flight attendant arrived quickly, speaking softly to the man and offering water. The woman asked if the seatbelt sign would stay on much longer, so the man could go to the restroom once it was safe. The attendant nodded and said she'd check with the cockpit. She walked to the front, knocked lightly on the cockpit door, and gave a short update through the intercom. Inside, the pilot rolled his eyes. "Of course it's her," he said under his breath. The co-pilot turned to look at him, frowning. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. The pilot smirked. "Always the same. Someone panics and starts asking questions. You'd think people could handle a little turbulence." The co-pilot didn't reply. He just shook his head slightly and went back to his instruments. Moments later, the pilot spoke through the intercom again. His voice had a joking tone, but the words stung. "Let's all stay seated, folks, especially those who think they can fly the plane better than the crew." A few passengers chuckled, not realizing who he was referring to. But those seated near the woman noticed her face. She stayed quiet, looking straight ahead, her expression calm but unreadable. The flight attendant returned, clearly embarrassed. She whispered softly, "I'm so sorry about that. Please don't take it personally." The woman nodded and smiled faintly. "It's okay," she said. "I've learned not to react too fast." The turbulence eased a few minutes later, and the rest of the flight continued quietly. The woman took out her notebook and began jotting down a few thoughts, not about her speech anymore, but about what had just happened.
She wasn't angry, just thoughtful.
She had faced worse in her career, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just a rude remark. It was the casual disrespect behind it, the way some people spoke without realizing how their words revealed their character. As the plane approached its destination, the pilot's tone softened slightly, perhaps realizing his earlier comments hadn't landed well. "We'll be touching down soon," he said. "Thank you for flying with us today." The woman glanced out the window again, watching the clouds part to reveal the city below. The landing was smooth. Passengers clapped quietly, a small tradition among some travelers. The woman unbuckled her seatbelt and waited for others to stand. She didn't rush to leave. She preferred to let the crowd move first. When she finally stood, she reached for her bag and stepped into the aisle. As she moved toward the exit, the pilot stepped out of the cockpit. He had his usual proud smile, greeting passengers as they left. When he saw her, that smile changed slightly and a little forced, a little stiff. "Hope you enjoyed the flight, ma'am," he said. "Sorry for the bumps. Guess some of us got a little nervous up there." A few people nearby turned their heads. The woman met his eyes for a brief moment. She didn't respond right away. There was a pause long enough to make the air feel heavy. Then she said quietly, "You seem to enjoy judging people before you even know them." The pilot let out a short laugh, pretending to take it lightly. "Just calling it like I see it," he replied. "No harm meant." She gave a small, calm smile. "That's the problem," she said softly. "Some people don't see much at all." Then she walked past him without another word. The co-pilot watched the interaction silently. He'd seen the whole thing and couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. The flight attendants exchanged glances. Everyone could feel that something serious had just happened, though the woman had handled it with grace and calm. Once she stepped into the terminal, she stopped near a window and took a slow breath. She could still hear the pilot's voice echoing in her mind. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone to check the time. Her next flight would take her to a conference hall filled with people who wanted to learn about fairness and leadership. She thought about how strange life could be, how the lessons people needed to hear often showed up in the most unexpected places. She had just lived through a perfect example of what she would be talking about that very afternoon. The irony made her smile. She shook her head slightly, adjusted her jacket, and walked toward the exit. The world was full of people who still judged others based on what they saw on the surface. But she also knew that the best way to change that was through patience and action, not anger. She didn't know yet that the pilot's words would come back to him in ways he didn't expect. For now, she was just another traveler walking out of the airport, blending into the crowd. But soon enough, the truth about who she really was and what she stood for would change everything. The day after the flight, the woman woke up early in her hotel room. The city outside was busy, filled with the sound of traffic and morning life. She sat by the window with a cup of coffee, staring at the skyline. Her mind kept drifting back to the flight. She had tried to shake off the pilot's words, but they lingered, not because of the insult itself, but because it reminded her of how many people still carried quiet prejudice without even realizing it. She had seen all kinds of behavior in her career. She'd dealt with people who lied, people who lost their tempers, and even people who tried to test her authority. But there was something different about moments like this. The small, subtle moments where people revealed who they really were, thinking it didn't matter. She opened her folder and looked over the speech she was going to deliver that day. It was about leadership under pressure, how people's real character shows when no one is watching. She smiled to herself at the irony. Life had just handed her a real story to tell. Later that morning, she headed to the conference hall. The hotel driver dropped her off at a large building filled with professionals, community leaders, and officers from different cities. As she walked in, people greeted her respectfully. They knew who she was, not just by title, but by reputation. She was known for being firm, fair, and calm under pressure. She treated people equally whether they wore a uniform or not. During her talk, she shared stories from her years of service, moments where people made quick judgments and how those judgments shaped outcomes. She didn't mention the flight, at least not directly, but her words carried the weight of that experience. She spoke about humility, about the importance of understanding others before labeling them, and about how leadership wasn't about power, but about humanity. The audience listened closely. Some nodded, some took notes, and others just watched her in quiet admiration. When she finished, she received a warm round of applause. But even as people came up to thank her afterward, her thoughts drifted back to the pilot. She wondered if he even realized how disrespectful he had been, or if it was just another day for him. That evening, back at the airport, she saw something that made her stop for a moment. As she passed by one of the gates, she noticed a group of flight attendants sitting together, talking quietly. One of them was the same woman from her flight that morning, the one who had apologized for the pilot's behavior. Their eyes met, and the attendant quickly stood up and walked over. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I didn't expect to see you again." The woman smiled kindly. "Neither did I." "I wanted to say thank you," the attendant said. "You handled everything so gracefully." I reported what happened. "I didn't mention your name, but I had to tell the truth." "It wasn't right what he said." The woman nodded slowly. "You did the right thing. Speaking up isn't always easy." The attendant sighed. "He's been spoken to before, you know. Not just about that kind of comment. About his attitude in general. But nobody ever said anything officially. Maybe this time will make a difference." The woman appreciated her honesty. She reached out and gently touched the attendant's arm. "What you did takes courage. Keep doing your job the right way no matter what others do." The flight attendant smiled, visibly relieved. "Thank you, ma'am. I mean it." As the woman walked away, she knew things were already moving behind the scenes. When airline employees report an issue like that, it doesn't just disappear. Someone somewhere would look into it, and that meant the pilot would have to answer for his words. She wasn't the kind of person to seek revenge. She just believed in accountability. A few days passed. She returned home, busy with meetings and daily work. But one afternoon, she received a call from an unknown number. When she picked up, it was a representative from the airline. The voice on the other end was polite, formal, and slightly nervous. "Good afternoon, Chief. My name is Daniel. I'm calling from the airline's customer relations department. I hope you don't mind the call. We wanted to speak with you regarding your recent flight on Monday." She kept her voice calm. "Of course. What's this about?" "There was an incident reported involving a member of our flight crew," he continued. "We've reviewed internal reports and statements. We'd like to apologize for the experience you had. We take these matters seriously." She paused. "I see. I appreciate that. I wasn't planning to file a complaint myself, but I'm glad you're addressing it." "Yes, ma'am," he said quickly. "We also understand your position and who you are. We want to assure you that the pilot involved has been temporarily removed from active flight duty while we conduct further review." The woman was quiet for a moment. She didn't feel satisfaction exactly, more a sense of calm understanding. "I hope you'll use this as a chance to teach, not just punish," she said. "People change when they understand why something is wrong, not just when they're told it is." The representative agreed, sounding genuinely respectful. "That's exactly our goal, Chief. And we'd actually like to ask if you'd be open to speaking with our leadership team about how to improve our sensitivity and diversity programs." "Your perspective would mean a lot." She smiled faintly. "That's a good start. I'd be happy to." The call ended on a positive note. For the rest of the day, she thought about how things had unfolded. A simple moment on a plane, one small act of disrespect, had turned into an opportunity for something bigger. Meanwhile, at the airline's main office, the pilot sat in a small conference room, waiting for his meeting with HR and his supervisor. He was uneasy, though he tried not to show it. He had been called out before, but never like this. He kept thinking back to that flight, to the woman who had looked at him so calmly, who hadn't argued, hadn't raised her voice. The way she spoke to him at the end, firm but composed, kept echoing in his head. When his supervisor entered, she didn't waste time. "We received a formal report about your comments on Flight 247, she said plainly. "You know what this is about." He shifted in his seat. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just trying to make light of a tense situation." His supervisor shook her head. "That's not how it came across. And the passenger you mocked wasn't just anyone. She's the chief of police from the city we serve." She's known for her community work and professionalism. He froze. She's what? The supervisor's tone didn't change. The chief of police. She didn't file the complaint. One of our flight attendants did. But the fact that she didn't make a scene says more about her character than yours. The pilot leaned back, rubbing his forehead. He suddenly felt small. For the first time in a long while, he realized that his careless words might have actually hurt someone, not just offended, but disappointed. She told our representative that she doesn't want to see anyone fired. The supervisor continued. But she expects us to make this a learning moment. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to attend a full bias and leadership awareness program. It's mandatory. And after that, you'll meet with our diversity panel, including her. He didn't know what to say. He just nodded quietly. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment when she showed him her badge, the look in her eyes. Calm, not angry, just clear. He realized she could have embarrassed him in front of everyone. She could have made a scene, recorded the moment, or demanded his removal. But she didn't. She had chosen dignity over confrontation, and somehow, that made him feel worse than if she had yelled. A few days later, the airline's internal memo went out to staff, reminding everyone about respect and professionalism toward passengers. It didn't mention names, but everyone in the company knew who it was about. The story spread quietly, whispered between employees. Some said the pilot got lucky that she was patient. Others said it was the perfect lesson in humility. As for the chief, she carried on with her work as usual. She didn't talk about the incident publicly. She believed in quiet change, the kind that starts small but grows with time. She knew that the real victory wasn't in exposing someone, but in inspiring them to be better. She often said that leadership isn't shown in front of cameras or crowds. It's shown in how you treat people when no one else is looking. The next time she got on a plane, she sat by the window again, just as calm as before. She smiled at the flight attendants, thanked them for their service, and looked out at the clouds. She wasn't thinking about what had happened anymore. She was thinking about how sometimes the best lessons in life come disguised as small moments, moments that test your patience, your dignity, and your belief in people. She closed her eyes and let the hum of the engines lull her into peace, not knowing that her next flight would bring an unexpected meeting, one that would change things even more than she imagined. A few weeks passed quietly after the incident. The chief had gone back to her daily routine, meetings, briefings, community visits, and long evenings in her office. Her days were filled with solving problems, guiding her officers, and helping her city move forward. But every now and then, when she passed by the airport or heard an airplane overhead, the memory of that flight would return. It wasn't bitterness that came to mind. It was reflection. She often thought about how people could learn from uncomfortable moments if they were willing to face them honestly. That belief had shaped her entire career. One afternoon, she received an email from the airline. It was from one of their senior training directors, inviting her to visit their main headquarters to help with a new training program on professional behavior and bias awareness. They wanted her to give a short talk to their pilots and staff, to share her perspective on leadership and respect. At first, she hesitated. She didn't like drawing attention to herself, and she didn't want anyone to feel publicly shamed. But then she thought about the impact it could make. Maybe, just maybe, her words could change how people thought, not only about passengers, but about everyone they meet in their daily lives. So she accepted. The airline arranged the visit quietly, without making a big announcement. They told her that one of the attendees would be the same pilot from that day. He had completed his training sessions and had requested to be present for her talk. The morning of the visit, she arrived at the airport early. She wore a simple navy suit, her badge tucked away in her bag. The airline's representative met her in the lobby and led her through the building. It was a large, bright space filled with model planes and posters about teamwork and safety. People greeted her politely, though a few seemed surprised to see her there. When she entered the conference room, about 30 pilots and crew members were seated, waiting. The room was quiet, respectful, but you could feel a hint of tension. Everyone knew why she was there, even if no one said it out loud. The pilot was sitting in the second row. When he saw her walk in, his posture stiffened. He didn't know if he should stand or stay seated. She noticed him immediately but didn't react. Her expression stayed calm, professional. The training director introduced her warmly, thanking her for taking the time to speak. Then she stepped up to the front. "Good morning," she began softly, her voice steady and warm. "I know we all come from different jobs, different worlds, but there's one thing that connects all of us. We deal with people every day. And how we treat those people says everything about who we are." The room was silent. She continued, her words simple but powerful. "I've worked in law enforcement for over 2 decades. I've seen people at their best and at their worst. But the moments that stay with me aren't always the big dramatic ones. Sometimes it's the small things, the way someone speaks, the assumptions they make, the way they treat a stranger when they think no one important is watching." She paused for a moment, then looked directly at the group. "A few weeks ago I was a passenger on one of your flights. Most of you wouldn't know me if you saw me. I was dressed like anyone else. I wasn't in uniform and I didn't introduce myself. I was just a traveler, like the hundreds of others you meet every day." The pilots shifted slightly in their seats. Some already knew what she was referring to. "During that flight," she continued, "something happened that reminded me how easy it is for people to forget that respect doesn't depend on status or race or appearance. It's something we owe to every single person, no matter who they are or what they look like." Her words carried weight. She didn't raise her voice, but every sentence landed with quiet strength. The pilot on that flight made a few remarks that, at the time, seemed small. But small things can cut deep when they come from a place of prejudice, even if it's unintentional. The man in the second row lowered his head slightly. He felt every word. "But I'm not here to humiliate anyone," she said, her tone softening. "I'm here because I believe people can change. We've all made mistakes, myself included. What matters is what we do after we recognize them. We can pretend it didn't happen, or we can use it as a mirror to see ourselves more clearly." For the next 20 minutes, she spoke about leadership, accountability, and empathy. She shared stories from her department, times when officers had to confront their own biases, times when understanding someone's story changed how they handled a situation. The room stayed silent the whole time. When she finished, she thanked them for listening. The director opened the floor for questions. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then slowly the pilot stood up. He looked nervous but determined. "Chief," he said quietly, "I was the pilot on that flight. I've wanted to apologize to you in person. I said things that were disrespectful and completely unprofessional. I thought I was being funny, but I realize now that my words were hurtful. I've spent the last few weeks thinking about it and I'm ashamed of how I acted." The room was still. All eyes were on the two of them. She looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I appreciate your honesty," she said gently. "It takes courage to stand up and admit when you were wrong. That's something a lot of people never do. What matters to me isn't that you made a mistake, and it's that you're willing to learn from it." He nodded, visibly relieved. "I've learned a lot," he said softly. "The training, the reflection, it opened my eyes. I used to think respect came automatically with my position, that being in charge meant I had the right to judge others. But I see now that leadership isn't about authority, it's about humility." She smiled faintly. "That's exactly right. True leadership has nothing to do with how high you stand, but with how you treat those you think are beneath you." The audience broke into quiet applause, not the kind that comes from entertainment, the kind that comes from understanding. The moment felt real, heavy, and sincere. After the session, a few people came up to thank her personally. The pilot waited until the end, then walked up slowly. "I really mean it," he said. "I'm sorry. I know I can't undo what I said, but I want to do better." She nodded. "You already are," she replied. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but awareness is the first step. Keep it going." He extended his hand hesitantly. She shook it, her expression kind but firm. That simple handshake carried more meaning than 100 speeches. As she left the building that day, she felt lighter. The air outside was crisp, and the sound of planes taking off filled the distance. She stood for a moment, watching one rise into the clouds. It struck her how symbolic it felt. Growth, change, elevation. People, like planes, could rise above their flaws if they were willing to face them. Back inside, the pilot sat alone in the empty room for a while after everyone left. He thought about how easily his pride had blinded him. All his years of flying, all his experience, none of it had taught him as much as one simple encounter had. Later that evening, He wrote an email to the airline's director, thanking them for the opportunity to learn and for bringing the chief to speak. He asked if he could volunteer for upcoming training programs to share his story with new pilots. "If my mistake can help someone else think twice before speaking," he wrote, "then maybe something good can come from it." Weeks later, the chief received a message from the airline's public relations team. They wanted her permission to include a short video clip from her talk in their internal training material. They explained how her visit had changed the atmosphere in their pilot community. People were talking, reflecting, and even suggesting new ideas to improve communication and respect among the crew. She smiled as she read the message. That was the kind of change she believed in. Quiet, steady, and real. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun go down, she thought about how unexpected life could be. One flight, one rude comment, one moment of silence, and now dozens of people were thinking differently. Sometimes lessons didn't come wrapped in kindness. Sometimes they came through discomfort. But when people chose growth instead of guilt, those lessons turned into something powerful. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the distant hum of a jet overhead. She thought maybe this is how real change starts, not with arguments but with understanding. She didn't need recognition or praise. She had seen enough in life to know that true impact often happens quietly, far from headlines. And somewhere in the sky the same pilot flew again, not just guiding a plane, but guiding himself toward becoming a better man. The pilot stood there frozen, the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. The woman's calm but firm voice still echoed in his mind. Around them, a few passengers had paused mid-step, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The badge gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, and though she had only shown it for a moment, it carried the kind of authority that didn't need explanation. He swallowed hard and took a shaky step forward. "Chief, I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. His tone had lost all its earlier sharpness. The woman looked straight at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It was steady, serious, and disappointingly calm. The kind of calm that made a person realize the weight of what they'd done. She said quietly, "You didn't mean it, but you said it. You didn't think anyone important would notice. You thought it was just another passenger." The flight attendant stood nearby, clutching her tablet nervously. She'd worked with the pilot for years, but she had never seen him look like this. Pale, nervous, small. The co-pilot had stepped out of the cockpit as well, watching silently as if waiting for the right moment to step in. "I think it would be best if we moved to the side," she said softly. "I don't want to make a scene." They moved closer to a corner near the boarding gate, away from the rest of the passengers. The chief folded her arms, her voice remaining even. "Do you realize what you said back there? How you talked about me and to me?" The pilot lowered his eyes. "It was a bad joke. I shouldn't have said it." "It wasn't just a joke," she replied. "It was disrespect. And disrespect becomes a habit if no one stops it." The pilot nodded slowly, but she could tell he wasn't used to being confronted like this. Most people probably just ignored him or laughed it off. She took a deep breath and said, "I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years. I've seen people from every background, every walk of life. I've learned that the moment you start assuming who someone is based on what they look like, you've already failed to see the person in front of you." The pilot shifted uncomfortably. "I understand," he muttered. "No," she said gently, "you don't understand yet. But maybe someday you will." She turned slightly to leave, but the co-pilot stepped forward. He looked genuinely troubled. "Chief," he said quietly, "I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened. I should have said something when I heard him make that comment. I froze, and that's on me." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "It takes courage to admit that," she said. "Thank you," the co-pilot nodded. "I'll be filing a report myself." "That wasn't right." The pilot's face tightened. "You don't need to do that," he whispered. But the co-pilot shook his head. "No, I do. We can't keep pretending things like that don't happen." The chief turned back to the pilot. "Listen," she said. "I'm not here to ruin your career. I don't want to humiliate you. But I do hope this makes you think. You carry hundreds of lives every day. People trust you with everything they have. That trust should be met with decency, not judgment." He didn't know what to say. Her words were simple but cut straight to the truth. Before she left, she handed him a small card. "This is my department's contact number," she said. "If you ever decide you want to understand why words matter, not just in policing but in every job where people depend on you, call that number. Ask for me. I'll talk to you." Then she walked away, leaving the pilot standing by the gate staring at the card. Later that evening, after she had checked into her hotel, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was the airline's customer service manager. He spoke carefully, his tone respectful but nervous. "Chief Daniels, we were informed about an incident on Flight 342 today involving one of our pilots. Our cabin crew filed a report. We'd like to apologize on behalf of the company." She sighed softly. "I wasn't planning to make a formal complaint," she said. "I didn't want to turn it into something bigger." "I understand," he replied, "but it's our responsibility to investigate. Would you be willing to share your perspective? It will help us handle the matter properly." After a pause, she agreed. "All right. But my goal isn't punishment. It's improvement. If you can make sure that man and others like him get some real awareness training, then maybe this can do some good." The manager promised to follow up. He sounded relieved, almost grateful that she wasn't out for revenge. That night she sat by the hotel window watching city lights twinkle in the distance. The event she'd come to speak at was about leadership and bias, and it felt almost ironic that she had just lived through an example of it hours earlier. She thought about how she could turn this into something meaningful. Maybe she could use it to show others that change doesn't always come from anger. Sometimes it starts with grace. A week later, she received an official letter from the airline. They thanked her for her cooperation and confirmed that the pilot had been placed on leave for further evaluation and required training. The letter also mentioned that the company was expanding its sensitivity and diversity programs, partly inspired by her feedback. She smiled faintly when she read that. It wasn't about getting anyone suspended. It was about making sure something changed. A few days after that, her office phone rang. It was the same pilot. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "Chief Daniels," he began, "I wanted to call you because, well, I read that card you gave me about 100 times before I picked up the phone." She said nothing, just listened. "I don't have an excuse," he continued. "I thought I was just being clever, trying to be funny. I didn't realize how ugly it sounded until I saw the look on your face. I've been through the company's training now, and they told me about empathy and respect and all that. But honestly, the moment that stuck with me was when you didn't yell. You just looked disappointed. That's what hit me." She let his words hang there for a moment before replying softly. "Sometimes silence says more than shouting. I'm glad you reached out. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry," he said again. "And I'm going to do better. I don't want to be that kind of man anymore." "I believe you can change," she said. "But remember, real change isn't what you say now. It's what you do later when no one's watching." He promised he understood, and after a few more words, they ended the call. Months passed, and life went back to normal for both of them. But the airline had taken her message seriously. They reached out again, asking if she would be willing to speak to their senior staff about leadership, respect, and dealing with unconscious bias. She agreed, not for the recognition, but because she believed in change that started with conversation. When the day came, she stood at the front of a conference room filled with pilots, managers, and crew members. The same pilot sat in the audience, his expression solemn but grateful. She began her talk by saying, "Every job that deals with people, whether you wear a badge, a uniform, or a pilot's wings, was about trust. People don't just trust your skills. They trust your character. And when that character slips, even for a second, it changes how people see you." The room was silent. Everyone was listening. She continued, "We all have moments when we say things we shouldn't. What matters is what we do after those moments. Whether we learn, grow, and do better next time." After the event ended, the pilot approached her quietly. "I've been trying to live by what you said," he told her. "I don't think I'll ever forget that day." She looked at him with a faint smile. "Then maybe it happened for a reason," she said. That evening, as she left the airport again, this time as a guest speaker, not a passenger, she thought about how life sometimes brings lessons in unexpected ways. A few careless words on a flight had turned into a story of humility and growth, and she realized something. True authority doesn't come from a badge or a title. It comes from how you choose to respond when someone disrespects you. The pilot learned that lesson too, and from that day forward, every time he greeted passengers boarding his plane, he meant it when he said, "Welcome aboard." The large training hall was filled with soft chatter as airline staff took their seats. It was a bright morning, and sunlight poured through the wide windows, lighting up the polished floor. Rows of pilots, flight attendants, and supervisors filled the chairs, their uniforms neat, their attention curious. They had gathered for the company's new Leadership and Human Respect seminar, a program that had started after the incident months ago. At the front of the room, a woman stood quietly, glancing over her notes. It was the chief. She looked calm as always, confident yet humble. Her presence carried a quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. When the company's director introduced her, the room applauded politely. Some had already heard about her, but most didn't know the full story. The director thanked her for agreeing to speak and explained briefly that this new training came from a real-life moment of learning. As the applause faded, she took a step forward and spoke in her calm, steady voice. "Good morning, everyone. I'm here today to talk about something very simple: respect. Not the kind that's written in handbooks or printed on posters, but the kind that lives inside how we treat each other every day." She paused and looked around the room. We live in a world where people are judged before they even speak. Sometimes by their job, their clothes, their accent, or their skin color. We may not even notice we're doing it. But the moment we stop seeing people as people, we lose something important: our humanity. The audience listened quietly. Her words weren't fancy, but they felt honest. She continued, "I've spent my career in law enforcement. I've seen what happens when bias and arrogance go unchecked. I've seen what happens when people forget that power is meant to protect, not control. And one day I saw it happen somewhere I didn't expect. Right on a plane." There was a brief murmur in the crowd. A few people shifted in their seats, realizing what story she was referring to. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. "That day someone said something careless," she went on. "Something small to them but heavy to someone else. And that moment could have turned ugly. But it didn't. Because I realized anger wouldn't fix it. Only understanding could." She glanced toward the second row. Sitting there quietly in full uniform was the same pilot. His face was serious, and though he looked nervous, he also looked determined. She smiled faintly. "That day taught both of us something. Me, that patience can open more doors than shouting ever could. And him, that humility doesn't weaken you. It changes you." The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that meant everyone was paying attention. She finished her talk with a simple message. Every job that puts you in charge of people's safety or comfort isn't just about skill. It's about character. So next time you meet someone who doesn't look like you or speak like you, remember, they might be carrying a story, a struggle, or a strength you can't see. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything. The audience began to clap, not loudly but sincerely. When she stepped down from the stage, the director thanked her again and handed her a small token of appreciation, a framed certificate with the words "for inspiring change through compassion." But what happened next surprised everyone. The pilot stood up from his seat, walked to the front, and asked if he could say a few words. The director hesitated for a second, then nodded. The pilot turned to the audience, cleared his throat, and said, "I was that pilot." The room went completely silent. He looked down briefly, then back up. "Months ago, I said something I thought was harmless. Something I thought was a joke. It wasn't. It was disrespectful. It was wrong, and I've had to live with that. When she revealed who she was, I realized I had not only embarrassed myself, but also let down the uniform I wear." He paused, his voice shaking slightly. "But here's the thing. She didn't yell at me. She didn't try to destroy me. She gave me a chance to learn. And that's what real leadership looks like." The chief watched quietly, her expression calm but proud.